The wind cut through Lila Hart's wool coat like 1,000 tiny knives as she pulled her daughter closer. June's small hand gripped hers with surprising strength for a 6-year-old, her other arm clutching the cloth bundle that held everything they owned. Behind them, the ranch house where Lila had lived for 5 years grew smaller against the gray December sky, smoke still rising from its chimney. Warmth and shelter that would never be theirs again. "Mama, where are we going?" June's voice was muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Lila didn't answer right away. She didn't have an answer, and the truth of that settled like a stone in her stomach. The Harts, her late husband Samuel's parents, had made their position devastatingly clear. A widow with a child was a burden they wouldn't bear, mouths to feed with no man to work for the privilege. Never mind that Lila had worked that ranch as hard as any hand, that she could rope and brand and break horses with the best of them. Never mind that she'd nursed old Mrs. Hart through pneumonia 2 winters back, or that she'd helped deliver 3 calves during last spring's difficult season. Samuel had been dead 3 months, victim of a horse that had thrown him wrong during what should have been a routine ride. The Harts wanted their land for Samuel's younger brother and his new bride. There was no room for his widow and child in those plans, no matter how many years Lila had given to that ranch. "Somewhere safe," Lila finally said, though her heart hammered with uncertainty. She had $23 sewn into the lining of her coat, a hunting knife, a small pot, some basic supplies, and her husband's old rifle with precious little ammunition. It wasn't much to build a future on. They walked for 2 days through increasingly hostile country, sleeping rough under what shelter Lila could improvise with their canvas tarp stretched between rocks or low branches. The Kansas Territory winter showed no mercy. The first night, Lila had managed to get a small fire going with the last of their dry kindling, and they'd huddled close to it, eating hard biscuits and jerky while the temperature dropped steadily. She'd wrapped June in every spare piece of clothing they had, then held her daughter through the long, bitter night, singing soft lullabies to keep her spirits up. The second day brought sleet that turned the ground treacherous. Lila's boots, already worn thin from years of ranch work, let in water with every step. June's small shoes were even worse, hand-me-downs that had never fit properly. By afternoon, both their feet were numb, and Lila knew they couldn't survive many more nights in the open. She tried to remain hopeful for June's sake, pointing out animal tracks in the snow, telling stories about the places they passed. But privately, terror gnawed at her. What had she been thinking? Should she have swallowed her pride, begged the Harts for mercy, agreed to work for room and board alone? Would servitude have been better than this? Number. She'd seen how the Harts treated their hired help who had no other options. She'd rather die free than live that way, and she wouldn't subject June to it either. On the 3rd morning, as snow began to fall in earnest, Lila knew they couldn't continue like this. June's lips had a bluish tint despite the scarf wrapped around her face, and the child's steps had grown sluggish, her body swaying with each movement. They needed real shelter, warmth, and they needed it within hours, not days. Lila forced down her panic and focused on the terrain ahead. The limestone bluffs rose ahead of them like ancient sentinels, their gray faces streaked with darker mineral deposits and riddled with dark openings that looked like empty eye sockets in the fading light. Lila had passed this way before with Samuel, remembered him mentioning caves in these hills that local trappers sometimes used. She'd never explored them. There'd been no reason to. Now, as the snow began to fall harder, transforming the landscape into a blinding white blur, Those dark mouths in the rock face looked like salvation itself. The first 2 caves were crushing disappointments, shallow, barely more than indentations in the cliff face, offering no more protection than a slight overhang might provide. The third went deeper, and Lila's hopes rose until she realized the floor was wet, water seeping from cracks in the walls, and the ceiling was so low she had to crouch. They couldn't survive in dampness like that. Lila was beginning to despair, her hands shaking as she helped June along the base of the bluff when they rounded a bend and found it. The entrance was wide enough for a wagon, partially hidden by a tumble of boulders that looked like they'd fallen ages ago and settled into a natural fortification. Inside, beyond the reach of the wind, Lila could already feel the difference in temperature. Not warm, but not the bone-cutting cold of outside. The passage sloped downward for 20 feet, the ceiling high enough that she could walk upright before opening into something that made Lila stop and stare with disbelieving wonder. The chamber was enormous, far larger than the entire Hart Ranch house. Her voice echoed when she called out experimentally, testing the space, the sound bouncing back to her from unseen walls. The ceiling rose at least 30 feet overhead, disappearing into shadow beyond the weak daylight filtering in from the entrance. But what caught her attention, what made her heart leap with desperate hope and brought tears to her frozen cheeks, was the sound of water. Not dripping or seeping, but the gentle lap of moving water against stone. "Stay here with the bundles, June," she said, though her daughter was already sinking down against the wall, exhausted beyond words. Lila had managed to light their oil lantern with trembling hands, and now she held it high as she moved deeper into the cave, each step careful on the uneven floor. The pond lay in a natural depression in the cave floor, perhaps 40 feet across and roughly oval in shape. The water was so clear she could see the rocky bottom even in the lantern light, could see the pale stones and dark crevices. And she held her breath, barely daring to believe. Fish. Real fish. Several of them, dark shapes moving lazily through the water. They weren't large, but they were definitely fish. And where there were some, there would be more. The pond must be fed by an underground spring. The water was too clear, too fresh to be stagnant. Lila knelt by the edge and dipped her hand in. Cold, yes, but not ice cold, not frozen. A spring-fed pond, protected by 30 feet of limestone and earth from the worst of winter's freeze. Lila's mind raced with possibilities. This cave stayed a steady temperature. She could already feel the difference from the bitter cold outside, and they were 50 feet from the entrance. The entrance itself could be blocked against wind and snow with their canvas and gathered stones. There was water, fresh water, and where there was water and fish, there might be a way to survive the winter. More than survive. There might be a way to actually live here until spring came, and they could make proper plans. "Mama!" June's voice held wonder. The child had followed despite being told to wait, and now stood pointing upward. High above them, daylight filtered through a natural chimney in the rock, a shaft that let in light and air, but was far too small and high for weather to threaten them. The faint beam illuminated the mist rising from the pond, making the cave look almost magical. "We're going to stay here," Lila said, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke. "We're going to make this home." The first days were the hardest. Lila used their canvas tarp to create a windbreak near the entrance, piling stones to hold it in place. She ventured out only when absolutely necessary, gathering deadfall wood from the sparse growth along the bluff. The wind was brutal, and twice she nearly lost her way in blowing snow, but each trip brought back precious fuel. Inside the cave, she built their first fire in a cleared space away from the entrance, using flat stones to create a hearth. The smoke rose naturally toward the high opening, drawn by the draft. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the wind shifted and smoke pooled near the ceiling. But it worked well enough. June helped as best she could, her small hands arranging kindling, hauling the lightest pieces of wood. At night, they huddled together under every blanket and piece of clothing they owned, listening to the wind howl outside while the fire burned low. On the fourth day, Lila made a fishing line from thread carefully unpicked from her spare petticoat, weighted with a small stone, and baited with a bit of salt pork from their dwindling supplies. She'd carved a hook from a bone button, painstaking work that took hours. Her hands shook as she lowered it into the pond. June crouched beside her, eyes wide with hope. When the line jerked and Lila pulled up a fish, a good-sized one, silvery and fighting, June let out a whoop that echoed through the chamber. They ate that night like queens, the fish roasted on flat stones beside the fire. It was the first time in days that Lila felt something other than fear. But she knew a fire and a fishing line weren't enough. Winter was just beginning, and they needed more than survival. They needed a way to truly live here until spring. The idea came to her one night as she lay awake, listening to June's soft breathing. The cave's dry alcove, set back from the main chamber, had caught her attention days ago. It was perhaps 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with a floor that rose slightly above the main cave, keeping it dry. If she could build walls, a roof, create an actual shelter within the shelter of the cave, she had no proper tools. What she did have was determination, knowledge gained from years of ranch work, and a daughter depending on her. The wood came slowly, each piece a hard-won victory. Every clear day, Lila ventured out, sometimes making 3 or 4 trips before exhaustion forced her to stop. She looked for fallen trees, deadfall that hadn't rotted too badly, cottonwood, ash, whatever the bluffs provided. She couldn't cut living trees. She had no proper saw, and her knife, though sharp, wasn't meant for that kind of work. But nature, it turned out, was a generous provider if you knew where to look. She developed a system. First, she'd scout, looking for suitable wood. Then she'd test it for soundness. Rotten wood was useless, would collapse under any weight. Good wood, she'd drag back to the cave entrance, a process that left her shoulders screaming and her hands raw even through her gloves. Then came the hardest part, wrestling the logs inside the cave, down the sloped entrance, across the main floor to the alcove. June helped roll the smaller pieces, her small hands pushing with all her might. The child never complained, though Lila could see the effort it cost her, could see how thin she was getting despite the fish they caught daily. They were both getting leaner, their clothes hanging looser, but they were surviving, and that was what mattered. Building the cabin frame required every bit of knowledge Lila had gained from years of watching ranch hands construct corrals, sheds, and line cabins. She wished desperately for Samuel's skill with wood, for his easy competence with tools. But Samuel was gone, and she had only herself. She used notched joints to fit logs together, a technique she'd seen but never performed herself. The first several attempts were disasters, the notches too shallow or too deep, the logs rolling away or sitting at odd angles. Her hunting knife became an extension of her hand as she learned to carve the notches properly, learned to judge angles and depths by eye and feel. Without proper nails or metal fasteners, she used wooden pegs she'd sharpened with painful care, hammering them into place with rocks. Her hands were soon raw and bleeding, despite the leather gloves she wore whenever possible. She wrapped her damaged palms with strips torn from her petticoat. kept working. The walls rose slowly, log by painful log. Lila chinked the gaps between them, with a mixture she'd developed through trial and error. Clay she dug from the pond's edge, mixed with dried grass she'd gathered before the worst snows came, and fish oil she rendered from catches that were too small to be worth eating whole. The mixture was messy to work with and smelled terrible while wet, but it dried hard and kept out drafts remarkably well. For a roof, she used their canvas tarp initially, then gradually replaced it with bark and smaller branches she'd collected, creating a pitched roof that would shed any moisture that might seep from the cave ceiling above. The door was a simple frame covered with leather she'd cut from her husband's old saddle, the one possession of his she'd managed to keep. She hung it with leather hinges, weighted it with stones at the bottom. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Inside, she built raised sleeping platforms using smaller logs and rope she'd salvaged from their supplies. This kept them off the ground, away from any dampness. She made a small hearth from flat stones, positioning it near the cabin's entrance where smoke could escape through a gap she'd left near the roofline. The flue wasn't perfect, but it drew well enough. By the time January's coldest days arrived, the cabin was complete. It was tiny, barely 8 feet by 10, but it was solid. Inside, with a fire burning in the little hearth and the door closed, the temperature was almost comfortable. The cave's steady climate, neither freezing nor warm, made all the difference. Outside their cabin, in the main cave, it was cool but not deadly. Inside the cabin, it was genuinely livable. Lila made furniture from scraps and ingenuity, a table from a flat piece of wood balanced on rocks, shelves from smaller branches lashed together. She even managed a crude chair, though it wobbled alarmingly. June thought it was the finest chair she'd ever seen. The pond became the center of their existence, their lifeline, in the truest sense. Lila fished every day, sometimes twice a day, her technique improving with each attempt. She learned the fish's habits through patient observation, where they fed in the mornings when the light from the high opening first touched the water, where they gathered in the afternoons, how they responded to different baits. Her first fishing line, made from unpicked thread and weighted with a stone, had been crude but functional. Over time, she improved her equipment. She fashioned a proper fishing rod from a flexible willow branch she'd found near a stream outside the cave, learned to judge the weight on the line by the rod's subtle movements. She made multiple hooks from various materials, wire from her sewing kit, carefully shaped bone, even a bent nail she'd found lodged in a piece of driftwood. Different baits yielded different results. The fish seemed to prefer small bits of their own kind, so Lila learned to save scraps from cleaning fish to use for bait. She also discovered they'd take insects she occasionally found in the cave and bits of the rabbits she sometimes snared. June learned too, and watching her daughter's education and survival filled Lila with conflicting emotions. The child was patient in a way that amazed Lila, would sit for hours with the line, watching the water with the focused intensity of a born hunter. She learned to read the subtle signs, the ripple that meant a fish was near, the way the line would twitch differently depending on whether it was current or an actual bite. The day June caught her first fish by herself, a respectable specimen nearly 8 inches long, Lila felt tears spring to her eyes. Her daughter was growing up in this cave, learning skills no 6-year-old should need to survive, but learning them with grace and courage that would have made her father proud. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were adapting, developing expertise, becoming something different from what they'd been at the Hart Ranch. Lila made tools from what she could find or fashion, each one a small triumph of necessity and ingenuity. She'd brought her sewing kit, a tin box with needles, thread, buttons, and a small pair of scissors, and with it, she repaired their clothes constantly, reinforced weak spots before they became holes, even made June a warmer vest from scraps of their old blankets, combined with rabbit fur from her successful snares. When her metal needles broke, she learned to carve wooden ones from small, straight twigs, smoothing them endlessly with her knife until they could pass through fabric. She made thread from plant fibers she gathered during brief forays outside, from raveled cloth, from anything that could be twisted into something resembling string. None of it was as good as store-bought thread, but it held seams together, and that was enough. She fashioned a crude but effective fish scaler from a flat piece of flint she'd found, learned to clean fish with minimal waste. The bones she saved, boiling them to extract every bit of nutrition, using the remaining bones for tools, needles, hooks, even small scrapers for working leather. Water was never a problem. The pond provided all they needed and more. But Lila learned early, after a bout of stomach sickness, that terrified her to her core, to boil all their drinking water first. She had nothing to treat serious illness out here. No doctor within miles, even if they could afford one. Prevention was everything, and she became fanatical about it. Every cup of water was boiled. Every piece of food was cooked thoroughly. Their hands were washed before eating, though soap was a luxury they couldn't afford to waste. Food management became a science. The fish were reliable, but not infinite. Lila never took more than 3 or 4 per day, careful not to deplete their only steady food source. She rationed their remaining supplies with military precision. Flour, salt, the small amount of coffee she saved for the coldest mornings when their spirits needed lifting most. The snares she set near the cave entrance brought occasional success. Rabbits or squirrels, precious additions to their diet that June celebrated with genuine excitement each time. Lila taught her daughter how to skin and clean small game, skills she'd learned as a girl growing up on the frontier. June approached these lessons with the same serious focus she brought to fishing, and Lila watched her daughter's capable hands at work with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She tried to vary their meals as best she could. Fish roasted on stones, fish boiled in their one pot, fish smoked over the fire on a rack she'd made from green willow branches. She made a kind of porridge from their dwindling flour, flavored with rendered fish fat and wild onions she'd found growing in a sheltered spot outside. February brought the worst storms. For days at a time, they couldn't venture outside at all. The wind screamed across the bluff, and snow piled high against their canvas windbreak. But inside the cabin, inside the cave, they were safe and relatively warm. June was changing. The frightened child who'd left the Hart Ranch was becoming someone different. Harder, perhaps, but also more confident. She could fish, could tend the fire, could prepare food without being told. She entertained herself with stones from the cave, creating elaborate games that Lila only partially understood. At night, by firelight, Lila told stories, ones she remembered from her own childhood, tales her mother had told her. She taught June her letters, scratching them in the dirt floor with a stick. They sang songs, their voices echoing strangely in the cave chamber. Lila watched her daughter and felt both pride and sorrow. This wasn't the childhood she'd wanted for June. But the child was strong, was learning to face hardship without breaking. That was worth something. The crisis came in early March, during what Lila hoped was winter's last gasp. She'd gone out to check her snares, leaving June in the cabin with strict instructions to stay put. The wind was bitter, but the sky was clear, and Lila was feeling optimistic about spring's approach. She'd been gone perhaps an hour when she heard it, a crack like thunder, followed by a rumbling crash. Her heart seized. She ran for the cave, abandoning the rabbit she'd caught, her only thought of June. Inside the entrance, she stopped short. A section of the cave ceiling near the entrance had collapsed, not catastrophically, but enough to block part of their path with rubble and to create a cloud of dust that made breathing difficult. The canvas windbreak was torn and snow was blowing directly into the cave. "June!" Her voice cracked with terror. "Mama!" The answering call came from deeper in the cave, near the cabin. Thank God. Lila fought through the dust and debris. June stood in the cabin doorway, eyes wide but not panicking. The collapse had been far enough from the cabin that they were in no immediate danger, but the situation was serious. The entrance was partially blocked. Their windbreak was destroyed. And most troubling, the collapse had stirred up so much dust and debris that the cave's air quality was terrible. But Lila had learned to think clearly in crisis. She'd had to these past months. First, she got June into the cabin and closed the door, limiting the dust they'd breathe. Then she assessed the damage. The collapse had actually created a new windbreak of sorts. A pile of rocks now partially blocked the worst of the wind, but they needed to secure the entrance better. Working quickly, she gathered the torn canvas and used it to create a new barrier, this time behind the rockfall, using the collapsed stones as anchors. She worked until her hands were raw and bleeding, until the wind couldn't penetrate so easily. The dust took days to settle. They stayed in the cabin mostly, breathing through cloth tied over their faces, keeping the fire low to minimize smoke. It was frightening, uncomfortable, but they endured. When the air finally cleared, Lila inspected the high opening that provided their ventilation and light. It seemed undamaged, thank God. The cave structure was still sound, just rearranged slightly. And in an odd way, the collapse had actually improved their situation. The new rock barrier at the entrance was more effective than the canvas had been. The cave was more protected now, more sealed against the elements. As March advanced, signs of spring appeared. The wind lost its cruelest edge. Icicles hanging from the cave entrance began to drip during the day. The pond's fish became more active, easier to catch. Lila began to venture further from the cave, scouting the surrounding area. She found wild greens beginning to emerge, gathered them eagerly. She found a creek running with snowmelt, followed it to a sheltered valley where early wildflowers were blooming. One day, she found wagon tracks on a distant ridge, evidence of human passage, the first she'd seen since they'd found the cave. The sight filled her with complicated emotions. They'd survived alone, she and June. They'd built a life in this cave through sheer will and ingenuity. She was proud of that. But they couldn't stay here forever. June needed more than this cave could provide. Education, other people, a real future, and Lila. Lila needed to find work, to build something more permanent. Still, there was no rush. Spring was just beginning. They had food, shelter, safety. They could take their time, make plans, prepare properly. Back in the cabin that evening, Lila watched June carefully clean their fishing hooks, preparing for tomorrow's fishing. The child's movements were sure and practiced. She'd become competent in ways that broke Lila's heart, even as it filled her with pride. "Mama?" June looked up. "Can we stay here a while longer, even when it gets warm?" Lila felt her throat tighten. "Why do you ask?" June shrugged, a gesture that looked strangely adult. "I like it here. I like when it's just us. I like that we built this ourselves." Lila pulled her daughter close. "We'll stay as long as we need to. But June, there's a whole world out there. You should see it." I know, June said quietly. But not yet. Not yet. Not yet, Lila agreed. That night, with a spring storm rattling the canvas at the entrance but unable to reach them in their snug cabin, Lila lay awake thinking about the future. They'd need to find a town eventually, need to find work and schooling for June. But they'd also need to carry this with them, this knowledge that they could survive anything, that they were stronger than they'd known. The Hearts had thrown them out, had left them to die in the winter cold. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd thrived in their own way. They'd built a home from nothing, had found abundance where others might have seen only stone and darkness. The pond's gentle rippling sounds drifted through the cabin door, which Lila had left slightly ajar now that the weather was gentler. Fish splashed occasionally, and somewhere high above, nightbirds called. Lila thought of the day they'd caught that first big fish together, how June's face had lit up with pure joy. She thought of all the small victories since. The first night in the completed cabin, the first successful rabbit catch, the day they'd laughed together at the wobbling chair and hadn't stopped laughing for 10 minutes straight. This cave had been a refuge when they'd had nothing. It had become a classroom, a proving ground, a home. Whatever came next, wherever they went, they would carry this time with them. Spring would come fully, eventually. The pond would warm. The fish would spawn. Wild flowers would bloom outside the cave entrance. And when they were ready, truly ready, they would emerge into that larger world, stronger and more capable than before. But that was for later. For now, there was this. A warm cabin inside a cave, a daughter sleeping peacefully, a full belly, and the knowledge that they had survived. Not just survived, but found a way to live with dignity and even joy in the midst of hardship. Outside, the storm passed, and moonlight filtered through the high opening in the cave roof, painting silver patterns on the pond's dark surface. Inside the tiny cabin, Lila finally let herself sleep, one hand resting on June's shoulder, both of them safe and whole and home.